Once the Mongols had control over Kiev and Rus, they had an amount of territory under their control, which is going to eventually work towards the benefit, particularly of the cities and the princes. The peasants had to worry about paying crops and labor obligations to both the princes and the Mongol rulers, and they grew increasingly impoverished. They also had to worry about harsh retribution. The Mongols introduced the notion of collective guilt into the justice system, such as it was. So not only was the perpetrator guilty of a crime and punished, but the perpetrator's family, even sometimes the village, also were held accountable, and this group responsibility was brutally enforced. So little wonder that the peasants were willing to give up what little independence they had to try and get the princes to fight for them. The princes didn't suffer quite so much. Yes, they were dependent on the goodwill of the Mongols and had to travel far to pay them tribute, but the peasants provided the tribute for them. The towns, rebuilt in the aftermath of the initial conquest, profited from the increased levels of trade the Mongols had brought. Remember this empire, and so trade routes extended from China. Moscow in particular, which had only been a minor town on the Russian landscape before the invasion, thrived from trade profits and from being the center to collect tribute for the Mongol rulers. And hey, if a stray ruble ended up in the wrong pocket, well, who's the wiser? The town grew in size as well, annexing nearby towns and villages that were too weak to resist or that had fallen behind on tribute payments. In addition, refugees from destroyed towns in other parts of Russia, particularly the south, started to settle there. The Orthodox Church's decision to relocate its center in the city provided even more benefit, more support for Russian princes who lived in Moscow, and more wealth. These princes began to depict themselves as defenders of Russia, but proving that would take some time. When a Mongol ruler was assassinated in 1357, well, I said it took a while, the empire fell into a long civil war, and the princes made their move. They raised an army and defeated the Golden Horde's forces in a battle that proved to be an important victory, because it showed that the Mongols could be defeated. Not surprisingly, the Mongol ruler at the time of this battle fell from power, because remember, you've got to prove your worth as a fighter. But the Muscovites' victory was short-lived. A stronger ruler was put in place, and he sacked the city as punishment. Remember that collective responsibility. Although it had been considered simply a side trip on the way to Europe, on the whole, Russia proved a useful conquest. And it was more than just a source of tribute. Another state on the periphery, Lithuania, was growing powerful, and Russia served as a check on that growth. Meanwhile, the Christians in Europe, upon hearing of Mongol attacks on Muslim kingdoms, considered the nomads to be their salvation from Muslim overlords. Muslims had taken over much of Eastern Europe, and the Christians believed that they were going to be freed from this at this point in time. They were so wrong. While the Mongols were tolerant of existing religions in the lands they conquered, they still conquered the lands and exhibited no preferential treatment. Europe would not be spared simply because of its Christian population. Batu aimed first at Poland and Hungary after conquering Rus. Poland fell quickly, a disaster for the forces of King Boleslav V, known as Boleslav the Brave. Heads up, by the way, if people are giving you nicknames, be careful what they name you, because Boleslav the Brave just means he went down well in battle. Hungary's ruler, King Bela, substantially underestimated the Mongols, considering them just another bunch of greedy nomads. Well, to be fair to Bela, Europe had been plagued by nomadic invaders of varying abilities for centuries. Germanic tribes, including the Huns and the Visigoths from the 5th century onward, had brought about the fall of the once mighty Roman Empire and continued to wreak havoc. Hungary itself had been inhabited by the Magyars, nomads from Central Asia. By the way, they're still there. They're the ethnic Hungarians. But awareness of that history should have clued King Bela into the possible effects of nomads. It didn't. His forces were defeated in 1240 CE. The next European force to face the Mongols was a collection of Christian knights led by a German prince from Silesia. Again, defeat for the Europeans. In fact, the forces were annihilated. The kingdom of Silesia was ransacked. Now all of Europe was exposed to the Mongols. Vienna was next in line. The people of Vienna huddled behind their gate, shaking in their medieval boots, waiting for the attack. But time was on the side of the Europeans. The Mongols actually withdrew. Can you imagine being in Vienna at this point in time? You could probably have felt the earth shaking from the horses coming towards you, and then suddenly, nothing. The Mongols withdrew as their leader prepared for a succession struggle following the death of Ogadai, the great Khan. The Golden Horde Empire would no longer expand westward. Instead, it remained centered in the capital Batu had located on the Volga River in what is now southern Russia until it was fragmented by civil war in the 15th century. So Europe was safe. Meanwhile, the Khanate of the Golden Horde eventually passed to Batu's brother Berka, the first Muslim ruler of that Khanate. And his religion would cause some family tension, particularly between him and his cousin Hulagu. Hulagu ruled the former Persian Empire here. That had been conquered as the Khwarezm and Kitakai empires during the early years of Mongol expansion. This area became the Khanate of Persia, or the Khanate of the Ilkhans, and formed the southwestern portion of the Mongol Empire. It started in the northwest Caucasus Mountains. Trying desperately to move that. There you go, here. This is the southern border of the Golden Horde Khanate, and this border was a much disputed boundary. But then the Persian Khanate extended south through Mesopotamia and along part of the east coast of the Arabian Peninsula, westward to the Indian border, taking in much of what had been the Arabic Empire. You should remember that the last Abbasid Caliph was executed when the Mongols, under Hulagu, took Baghdad in 1258. I mentioned this when discussing the end of the Abbasid rule. The Caliph wasn't the only person in Baghdad to die during that takeover, of course. The people of Baghdad resisted the Mongol invasion, and we know by now how the Mongols tended to react to that. They rained down death and destruction. Around 800,000 deaths, it's reported, and the complete sacking of Baghdad, the center at that time of Islamic civilization, which totally ticked off Hulagu's Muslim cousin and neighbor, Berka. Without a central ruler or central administration, the Islamic world was on shaky ground. But it was far from obliterated. Once Iraq and Persia were conquered, Hulagu continued westward with an eye on Syria and Egypt. Syria went down easily, for the same reason Rus had. The elite groups, in this instance descendants of Saladin, the one-time ruler of Egypt during the Abbasid Empire, and European invaders refused to join forces to repel the invasion. Egypt was not such an easy target. While Hulagu was in Central Asia coping with yet another succession struggle, I hope you can pinpoint a major weakness in the Mongol Empire by now, his forces were defeated by Egyptians, known as the Mamluks. These are former slaves who had been enslaved and sold in Egypt by the Mongols. But more to the point, cousin Berka actually helped the Egyptians fight against Hulagu's forces. So Mongol is helping Mongol enemy here. As we saw, succession struggles constituted a major weakness in the Mongol Empire. And it makes sense when you consider the nomadic tradition of selecting leaders. Everyone had to agree on the suitable candidate, and there was trouble when that agreement wasn't unanimous. Added to the mix, the requirement that rulers had to be direct descendants of Chinggis Khan, and so each succession struggle would be meaningful to each Khan. Thus, Batu was distracted from invading more of Europe. Hulagu was distracted during his drive west to Egypt. This also causes irreparable divisions in the Mongol Empire. Berke's refusal to accept Kublai Khan as the Great Khan in 1260 split the Mongol Empire. He then expanded that split by allying with just about all the states surrounding the Ilkhanate, including the Mamluks in Egypt, the Byzantines, the Genoan city-state in Italy. He launched a full-scale war against Hulagu, who had supported his brother Kublai. The war between Berke and Hulagu lasted beyond their lifetimes, and the religious animosity between the primarily Muslim Khanate of the Golden Horde and the Ilkhanate lasted even longer. And so you have division on division. And amid this chaos, conflict, particularly over the boundaries of the Caucasus Mountains, continued between the Khan of the Golden Horde and the Ilkhan. This will leave the Ilkhan in particular vulnerable to further invasions from another source. The Mongols bring change, as most nomadic groups did. Their encouragement of different ideas and innovations certainly contributed to the international exchange of information. Remember the Italian adventurer Marco Polo, for example, who shared his tales of the East with a fascinated Europe, as well as the hard-won lesson of all the peoples conquered who learned of the glories and power of gunpowder. Look at how much international trade expanded with their encouragement. And this is even before Rus, Poland, and Hungary were taken. They also contributed to the rise in power and prestige of certain cities, such as Moscow, and religions, by creating an environment in which these all could thrive, and by providing active support at times. Moscow and the Orthodox Church come to mind as great examples. They grew richer and stronger thanks to being the center of the Mongol Empire in Russia, and their leaders grew more powerful as they started depicting themselves as Russia's only hope. But not all of the exchanges facilitated by the Mongols were good, even if we ignore momentarily the massive loss of life imposed on resisting cities. The spread of Mongol power is believed to have been responsible, as I've mentioned, for the spread into Europe and China of bubonic plague, the Black Death, a fatal epidemic that eviscerated the populations of Europe and the Middle East and East Asia. The devastation was incredible. After 5 years, 25 million persons, 1/3 of Europe's population, had died from the plague. The Mongols were not the only important nomadic group, nor were they the most ferocious. Another group, also out of Central Asia, had bloody conquest on its mind. And the Mongolian Empire, weak in its later years as Khan fought with Khan, was the main target. This group was not Mongol, it was Turkic, led by a man named Timur Ilang. It means Timur the Lame. He was injured in the leg by an arrow when he was a kid. Timur Ilang was a highly cultured member of the land-owning nobility in Central Asia. He was born in 1336 and matured as the Chagatai, Golden Horde, and Ilkhanate regions were beginning to collapse. This provided fantastic opportunity for Timur Ilang to take control over the world, at least the world that he knew. Timur's forces were located in Central Asia, in Samarkand, and they wreaked havoc and destruction while conquering parts of Persia, Mesopotamia, India, and southern Russia. Their ferocity was legendary. Timur built a pyramid of tens of thousands of skulls outside of one city in Asia Minor. Clearly, his sense of culture included new forms of sculpture. Timur's conquest didn't bring any benefits in terms of increased trade or cultural interaction. Instead, after planning and executing an attack, he invariably returned home to Samarkand instead establishing any kind of bureaucracy to administer his newly conquered territory.